Hey, folks, welcome back to Mind Matters. Today we'll be looking at John F. Schumaker's book, In Search of Happiness Understanding an Endangered State of Mind. It's really about, ultimately, something we've been talking about on the show for quite a long time now, values. And in his book, Schumacher lambasts the happiness industry as well as a number of other paradigms that are common to contemporary Western culture, and tells us why these paradigms of happiness, things that we're told to pursue in order to make ourselves feel happy, are in fact quite often those things that make us desperately unhappy and leave us in a kind of uh, downward spiral of meaninglessness, unhappiness, and constantly looking for the new thing that our society says will make us happy. Um, he also looks at a number of strategies and approaches to life that seem at odds to what we've been told will make us happy, but that have a kind of history and longstanding tradition in certain cultures of success. So we'll be discussing a few of those things as well today. And it's interesting. The overall feeling I get from the book is that happiness, something that we're all kind of seeking on some level or another, isn't something that we can attain head on or directly. It's rather something that is an outgrowth of the values that we hold, the things that we think, the actions that we take, and it's just sort of a natural byproduct of the way we live our lives and the things that we hold dear to us, the things that we prioritize, the things that we give our energy to. So we'll be looking at a number of different things that we may be doing consciously and unconsciously in the pursuit of happiness, things that we're kind of programmed to follow through on. A big one of those things is consumerism and materialism. We'll be getting into that too. But first, I wanted to start by reading a couple of passages on the subject of humility and compassion, which Schumacher comes back to in the book as kind of these cornerstones of character and values that would seem to um, naturally make us happy when we practice them. So here are a couple of passages. He says, humility is the ability to see through the mirror and not to be continually distracted by one's own reflection. It has nothing to do with humiliation. The actual word humble traces to the Latin word humilis, related to humus or earth. Humility is a state of groundedness in which we are aware that we are part of a larger whole. It prevents the lapses into arrogance that generate conflict and obscure the harmonies that lace themselves into earthly existence. Humility makes it easier to be honest and authentic, which promotes healthy relationships and greater overall social being. Despite its ability to contribute to deep happiness, humility has become largely extinct as a character trait. But at various times in the past and in other cultures, it was seen as a kind of greatness. Humility is an intelligent self-respect that allows us to maintain a balanced perception of ourselves and the world around us. Within it is a comforting realism that insulates us from false hope, disappointment, and dejection. Humility is a high level of consciousness that readies the mind for life's ups and downs. It can smooth the transitions from one stage of life to another. Humility stimulates the positive type of small-mindedness that is currently in such short supply. And then he goes on to discuss compassion a little bit. He says, the word compassion comes from the Latin words com and passio, which together literally mean with suffering. It may be that the alleviation of others' suffering is a life meaning that transcends all others. but that involves too much compromise for most palates today. Compassion still feels good in small doses, and token acts of charity have even become fashionable, especially if they have an audience. But compassion fatigue sets in very quickly with today's pain allergic consumers. Compassion and narcissism are opposite ends of the continuum. Just as self absorbed narcissists make excellent consumers, highly compassionate people are flops in the consumption stakes. By its design, compassion is a mindscape that makes people and life, rather than objects and pleasures, into top priorities. The whole goal of consumer indoctrination is to shift priorities to the material realm while sweeping life considerations under the carpet. Now, in a little bit of an act of humility, Harrison, I thought I would just share that I am not immune to going on Amazon and looking at products and reading reviews and wanting the very best of whatever it is that I've decided I really want or really need. And it surprises me sometimes how much energy can go into such a pursuit. Um, and like I'd read this book a few years ago, so in the back of my mind, whenever this happens, whenever I'm on YouTube researching a product or going on Amazon, there's this little voice in the back of my head that reminds myself, this isn't going to really make me happy. I have this dopamine hit right about now in anticipation of when I attain this object that is, the perfect little whatever it is. And of course, there's something to be said about researching and getting the best value for your money and looking for what you need and reading what other people have to say about it. So it's not so black and white as that, but there is certainly an element of looking for happiness where it's ephemeral, where it's cheap. It's not this kind of deep happiness that Schumaker is discussing here and is laying out for us to that's available, really. But it does require work. It does require certainly requires us being honest with ourselves about how we go about trying to attain happiness, getting a fix of something. And it could be, it could be in the form of a cookie. It could be in the form of 10 cookies or a drink or binging on some show. But I have to say, I've noticed at those times when I've quite often there is a certain amount of momentary pleasure, this dopamine hit, as I mentioned. But then there's, if I'm really paying attention, there is a time afterward. It's like a little bit of a depression, a little bit of an emptiness, a sadness, because what comes up must go down, and so it's very interesting to revisit this book and to think about those ways that can be cultivated in ourselves to create a deep happiness.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess the first thing I want to talk about is what really is happiness. Excuse me. Because one of the points that Schumaker makes in the book is that we do live in a time where happiness is seen as the goal, right? And people are looking for happiness. And so he quotes, a lot of titles of books published and articles in magazines and about the search for happiness and how happiness is it's all over the place. And then there are all the polls about asking people what their life satisfaction is, how happy they are, and people seem to have a drive, not only an internal drive, but there's also the social push for the achievement of happiness.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the several points he makes in the book is that happiness isn't so simple, and that one of the ways in which people strive for happiness and the way that they think about it is in terms of these kind of dopamine hits, like these short-term pleasures, basically. And I think Schumaker would agree that isn't really happiness and at least not happiness as he's talking about it, and as many others have thought about it, because there, how does he put it? He basically says that there's this like what he calls like supercharged happiness that people are striving for, and it's this it is tied with this consumerism and materialism, and it's like it's getting the stuff to make you happy, and um, and yet people don't seem to be very happy. Like they might say that they've got relatively decent lives, but like depression rates are rising, suicide rates are rising, and it doesn't seem like we're very happy. So so what does it mean? Like what is it actually? He basically I don't know if I know he talks about like the ancient philosophers like Aristotle and then the Stoics and their kind of views on happiness, and I think he'd probably be more in line with that philosophical school. So, if, like with Aristotle, for instance, he said that happiness was the ultimate goal of humanity. I believe the Greek was eudaimonia or something like that, eudaimonia, and but he had this whole system of what exactly is happiness. So there's like here's a definition from pursuitofhappiness.org, which is devoted to pursuit of happiness. Goes through all kinds of things like various philosophers and their thoughts on happiness, and then all kinds of like scientific studies and other things like that. I just found it while researching for the show. So according to them, like after a write-up on Aristotle, here's their conclusion about what he thought of happiness. Happiness is the ultimate end and purpose of human existence. Happiness is not pleasure, nor is it virtue. It is the exercise of virtue. Happiness cannot be achieved until the end of one's life. Hence, it is a goal, not a temporary state. Happiness is the perfection of human nature. Since man is a rational animal, human happiness depends on the exercise of his reason. Happiness depends on acquiring a moral character, where one displays the virtues of courage, generosity, justice, friendship, and citizenship in one's life. Those virtues involve striking a balance or mean between an excess and a deficiency. Happiness requires intellectual contemplation, for this is the ultimate realization of our rational capacities. So that was kind of like that's how people, at least who have like read the classics for hundreds of years, have thought about happiness, at least in that context, in the context of ethics. And if you are engaged in any kind of like intellectual contemplation, that might be something that you defined, that at least that definition of happiness. So it's way more expansive than the idea of happiness just being like this feeling that you have, because I think that's one of the criticisms that Schumaker has about this search for happiness, is that we're looking for a state to be in, a mood to be in, or an emotion to feel in a given moment. And like you said, what goes up must come down. So like moods don't last forever, emotions don't last forever. Like no, when they go on for an abnormally long time, then we generally consider that to be a form of like mental illness, like being in a state of mania, for instance, or a severe depression. In the ordinary functioning of emotions, like they come when they're needed and they don't last very long. They can last longer, and it can become like a mood where like feeling an emotion for an extended period of time. But to constantly be going for the hit is essentially it's a form of like natural drug addiction. It's like you're basically looking for a drug hit, like repeatedly over and over, and that doesn't work. Essentially, if you are looking for like a long-lasting sense of whatever you think of as happiness, you're not going to get it by just going for those hits, those repeated hits, and trying and seeking them out, like some kind of like sensation seeker, like adrenaline junkie. Yeah. It's you're not actually going to get the goal that you're seeking out to fulfill. So like after that, the Stoics basically had a similar idea, basically saying that the goal of humanity was basically reason, because we are rational animals, like Aristotle thought, and that to achieve happiness would basically be to live in accordance with nature. I believe that's the way they put it. And so that the idea would be, if you are living in accordance with nature, with your human nature, then you would be happy. So the question then becomes, well, what is human nature? And of course, the Stoics had their whole system, and that's, that's what every kind of religion and philosophy seeks out to define, is what it means to be human. Because if you can understand what it means to be human, you can understand what your purpose might be, what the collective purpose might be, and that might, well, hopefully, that might inform your own personal individual purpose, within that larger purpose. So that's one of the first, and I think one of the most important points that Schumaker makes, is that when we're looking at like momentary, like passing pleasures, that probably has a role in like human life, in human nature, and in overall happiness, but it's leaving out all of these other aspects that must contribute to this state of happiness that we're allegedly seeking.
Yeah.
So he talks about like he gives a list. He basically says it neglects important aspects that contribute to happiness. So he gives the examples of like social, spiritual, like relational and intellectual aspects to searching for happiness. Basically, if you're only feeding this kind of self-centered, selfish, self-oriented like a part of yourself that wants its own pleasures for itself, you're going to be missing out on like the social aspect of human nature that you're not fulfilling, and the intellectual aspects, like Aristotle thought too, and the spiritual, and yeah, it's like all of these things. Basically, you have to be aiming at multiple targets at the same time, which might constitute like one large target, in order to get the bullseye, and the bullseye being happiness. And even then, like if you're a Stoic or Aristotle, it's like you might never even get there. It's just the goal that you're constantly pushing towards, and by acting in such a way and living your life like in accordance with that direction, then maybe you'll eventually get happiness. But for them, it's like, it's not something that you are actually like, oh, I'm happy right now. It's like, no, happiness was the goal. That was like the result of living a good life,
Right.
of striving for the good, and not something that, well, you could even make a comparison to like the religious framework of heaven and hell, right? It's not, you're striving for heaven, and you might get little pieces of good things along the way in your life, but like in the religious perspective, heaven comes after you die. It's not something that necessarily you experience like in its full totality during life. And happiness would be something similar. Happiness is a goal that comes after you've lived your life. Maybe I don't know for sure what the Stoics and Aristotle thought, if happiness might be achieved like late in life, or if you had to die first. I don't know. I don't think so. But it was basically something that you had to really work for. And in that from that perspective, then you can look, okay, so you've got someone like living their life in such a way that that true happiness, like pure happiness, as Schumaker might call it, is the goal that they're aiming at, and like the target that they're aiming at. But then as they're doing that throughout their life, that'll have certain like ramifications, certain consequences for what happens in their life, and then what they experience in their life. So there will be social, intellectual, spiritual aspects, and like and personal ones, of course. And in those situations, like for someone today, like who's pursuing that as a life path, they might have moments of what they'd call happiness.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, oh wow, I really felt happy in this moment. But that won't be the goal. Like the goal isn't to experience those feelings of happiness. Like I just read a book on Thomas Aquinas to get an idea of his kind of like theology and philosophy, and he was like an Aristotelian, so he kind of was in that tradition. And for him, how did he put it? Like pleasures and like what we might call like moments of happiness were for him like the what happens when you realize a good. So
Mm-hmm.
when you basically realize something that's in your nature, like that might even be like feeding yourself, like eating. So because for Aquinas and for Aristotle, we kind of like had levels. So like on the basic physical, like biological level, there are certain goals inherent in human nature, and one of them is to feed yourself so that you survive, so that you don't die. And we have that in common with all life forms, for instance. So that feels good, like, right? It feels good when you have a meal, when you're not starving.
Mm-hmm.
And so that feeling would be the basically the fulfillment of that that end, that goal that is within you. And if you just go up the levels, it's like you can find instances in all of those levels where things feel good, where there's just a general feeling of like
Well-being.
well-being and harmony. It's like so you can have that feeling like emotionally when you're having a good time with a person. Could be when you're joking around with them and you're having a fun, good conversation, right? That feels good, and those are the memories that kind of like that we cherish, and especially if they're with loved ones, doing something meaningful with a loved one, with your family or with your friends. And then also intellectually, like when you're thinking about something or you're reading about something and something makes sense or you make a connection, it's like that feels good. It's like, oh wow, I hadn't thought about that, and that makes sense now. Like all these things are like it's a positive emotion. And so that would be like the realization of an end or a purpose or a goal or hitting a target, along that way. But for all these thinkers, I think, and Schumaker included, it's like but the big picture is what you have to look at. It's like how are you living your life in totality? Like what's the totality in which you find those little moments of happiness? And that's what well, I think that's what we should get into.
Yeah. Well, that's very true. I mean, he looks at so many different dimensions to what makes a person happy, what we're told should make us happy. One of the things that he gets into with compassion, with service to others, is something that we've been reading about quite a bit on SOT, which is that people who actually take a certain amount of time per week to give of themselves in a kind of volunteer capacity, quite often feel like they are happier or more fulfilled, and seem less susceptible to the thoughts of unhappiness or depression or sadness because of this kind of outward directional flow of energy and attention that they're giving to others. But you said something a little earlier about the Stoics and this kind of life of reflection and intellectual development, which I found interesting because another thing you said was that we're constantly looking for stimulation, things that will excite us and give us that short thrill of entertainment that we think will make us happy. And Shoemaker has a few interesting things to say about boredom, and the reasons why boredom, in one sense, makes us very depressed and in need of assistance and help, but if approached in a certain way, can also be very productive. We don't need to be stimulated all the time. We don't have to be looking for this kind of something that will fill the void of boredom that we're experiencing in our lives. So, just wanted to read this. He says, "But the modern economy loves nothing more than a society of people trying to spend their way out of the black hole of boredom and ennui. Of this, anthropologist Gregory Batson wrote recently that, quote, our economy has become very dependent on the whole cycle of boredom, novelty, more boredom, and more entertainment. Similarly, James Fitchett of the University of Nottingham presented a conference paper titled The Anatomy of Apathy, Perspectives on Consumer Boredom, in which he points out that boredom has become the chosen pathology of the consumption-oriented, market-structured age in which we live. It is clear that the preferred citizen has become one whose attempts to be happy have been channeled into escaping the, quote, hell of the same, as it has been called. The booming boredom industry is doing everything in its power to sell the idea that we deserve to be thrilled every moment of our lives. It is generally assumed that the best way to conquer boredom is to find something that is stimulating. But this approach has proven ineffective with the chronic boredom that is now so prevalent. Stimulation and diversion only seem to hasten the process whereby the bored person reaches the point of no return and becomes unresponsive, and even neurologically drained. Boredom experts have come to see that the best cure for boredom is boredom. It is far better to write out one's feelings of boredom than to fight them whenever they arise. This breaks the cycle of needing increasingly stronger stimulation in order to get the same relief. Sounds like drug addiction.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, it gradually allows one to reverse the cycle and begin to experience emotion without all the forced promptings. He's got a great passage somewhere in the book. I think it's a quote from a writer who describes drinking tea and the pleasure, the momentary pleasure of just appreciating this simple, inexpensive, subtle cup of tea. And it goes back to the idea that we've been told we need these big things to satisfy ourselves. There's this constant drive to attain these big things. But there are momentary pleasures where, if given our full attention, can fill us and make us happy. Not quite in the same way as attaining goals or making connections, as you were saying earlier. But there are things that we can do for ourselves, small things that can give us the pleasure that we would that we're used to paying much more to attain. And this gets into another idea that Schumaker gets into, which is the pursuit of success, material success, especially in Western culture, and how that's also a drive that has this kind of never-ending end goal, where the more you attain, seemingly the more you are without, or the more you want, because of this competitive dichotomy that we set up in our minds with other people and what they have. And it's the reason why greed is so prevalent in the U.S. It's the reason why people are in incredible amounts of debt, more than they ever were. And it's the reason why people just shut down after a while in, pursuing the rat race, trying to fulfill ambitions that are neither necessary or productive, ultimately. So that's also another kind of big piece to this whole thing. It's pursuing ambitions that that don't ultimately provide value in a person's life, but that detract the time and the energy that you might otherwise give to your family members or friends, or pursuits that are soul feeding. So that's another big one.
Mm-hmm. Well, that reminded me of a couple sentences in the book. I'll just read. He said, as a personality trait, materialism has been shown by numerous studies to create obstacles to happiness. Among other things, a strong materialistic orientation has been associated with envy, narcissism, relationship problems, and a diminished ability to feel empathy for others.
Mm-hmm.
Then a couple pages later, he writes, quoting a dissertation by Judith Ann Johnson on greed, where she argued that greed is primarily determined by culture. So it's not just like like greed would be like a universal, like human, like tendency, but the prevalence of greed and like the impact that it has is culturally determined. And she found that maximal greed was produced by a combination of capitalism, materialism, hypercompetition, and discrimination. Not having read Johnson, that dissertation, I'll take her and him at his word, just as a starting out point. And because if you think about that, a combination of capitalism, materialism, hypercompetition, and discrimination. So I guess she'd probably be looking at different countries and like comparing the cultures of different countries, and that you'd find the maximal greed when those are combined. And of course, when you have a culture like that is hyper competitive, with rampant discrimination and materialism and capitalism, it's kind of a recipe for disaster, because that's a very like one-sided development, kind of like, we were talking earlier about this sensation seeking and striving for these like moments of passing pleasure. It's like that's very one-sided. You're leaving out all of the other things that will give a more broad and expansive happiness by focusing on just these tiny little things. So you've got um, it's so there's a combination of, well, I guess, all the things that go into culture. So there would be like the unstated but acted out like principles on which like a culture is based. These would be the, like basically that's an example would be with this materialistic framework. So a lot of people wouldn't necessarily think about it, right? They just kind of adopt it by osmosis. They're raised in that environment, and it just becomes part of them. They don't think, oh, I'm a materialist, and I believe this, this, and this. It's just they just act it out.
Right.
It's something they act out unconsciously. And so when you combine that with this hyper competitiveness, it is this very individualistic like worldview, where it's very easy to see in that environment how people would be basically trained and programmed to think only of themselves and to think only of those those momentary pleasures that they're seeking for. And it's like they're constantly searching for it, but it's never enough, right? And I think that's what you're talking about in that quote with where you made the reference to drug addiction. It's like you're constantly chasing something and you never quite get it. Of course, that's what happens in drug addiction. It's also what happens in what was the example I was thinking of, where well, just basically, well, yeah, the example I was thinking of was actually serial killers, because what was the book? Who Fights Monsters? I think it was this book on
Whoever Fights Monsters.
Whoever Fights Monsters,
Mm-hmm.
where he's talking about serial killers and the work he's done with them. So I can't remember the author, sorry. But he was basically like an FBI profiler. I think he was one of the guys that they based the Mindhunters show, the David Fincher one, on. And he's talking about, well, the reason I bring up psychopaths and serial killers, it's just kind of like a really extreme example to show basically what...
I know where you're going.
Yeah, what happens on an extreme level. So you can probably think of examples like in yourself that aren't as extreme. But basically, one of the features that serial killers seem to have is that they develop this kind of fantasy life where they have this this fantasy of like the perfect whatever, like the perfect kill, and it becomes this controlling fantasy for them, where they constantly go back into their imagination and they're living out this fantasy. And so and it's often, typically, of course, like a very violent fantasy. They get sexual pleasure out of this fantasy. It's like while a more normal like kid, for instance, would maybe have a Playboy magazine or something, and that would be what he goes to for that kind of hit. For a serial killer or a budding serial killer, it would be he gives the example, like a lot of them would read like detective stories, and they'd identify with the killer in the story, and they'd develop this story essentially that would be their fantasy life, and they would fantasize repeatedly over the years, like starting from young teenage years, maybe even before, and they develop this fantasy in their minds of and that's why when you watch like TV shows about profilers, and they have their one thing that they do, and that's their kind of like their signature. It's because that's the fantasy that they're trying to act out. Mm-hmm. And so in their mind, they basically build up this fantasy where it gets to the point where, oh, well, now they actually have to do it. It's not just in their mind anymore. To get the full like pleasure, they have to act it out.
Right.
So what they find is that when they do, they go and they kill someone like in exactly the way that they fantasized, but it wasn't quite good enough. Mm-hmm. Like they did something wrong, something didn't go quite right, but it didn't give them the pleasure that they were expecting. And so they do it again and again and again. And it's this constant chasing after something that they never actually get. And that's kind of an extreme version in a nutshell of what we're all doing when we're chasing this this dream of happiness. In a way, happiness as defined by the way that we search for it culturally. Mm-hmm. The ways in which we think about it, and that we the form that it takes when we fantasize about it and we think about it, we never quite get there. It remains elusive because it's not, to go back to the Stoics, it's not in accordance with nature. We're searching for something that, like, we weren't actually designed to fulfill. It's this what you might call like a contingent goal that we've developed for ourselves, a purpose, an end, an aim, a target that isn't really what we're part of our nature. Like, if we were to actually come to know ourselves and discover a bit more about our nature, we'd see, whoa, well, I shouldn't even be searching for that in the first place, because that's not the reason I'm here. Like, that's not my purpose. Mm-hmm. When you try to force it and make it your purpose, it's like you're batting your head up against a brick wall, because you're coming into contact with objective reality, and objective reality is telling you, well, this isn't right. Mm-hmm. Right? It's not going to work, because that's not how the universe is set up. That's not there are purposes, there are inherent objective purposes in the universe and in yourself and in your nature, your individual and your collective nature. And if you're trying to get outside of that framework, you're just going to fail, because it's not the way. It's like trying to use a microwave to make a milkshake. It's like, it's not going to work. It's not a purpose that is inherent in your nature. When you try to go against your nature, you're just going to fail.
That's an interesting analogy. Using
the
a
milkshake
microwave for a milkshake. but yeah, although it is a very extreme example, it's also pretty striking as well. And Whoever Fights Monsters, among others, is one of those visceral books that really does kind of help one to put the kibosh on the living the fantasy life and spending inordinate amounts of energy and time and focus and imagination in self-satisfying pursuits. And it's really scary to think that anything that destructive to others and to oneself starts in the realm of fantasy. So we're being told to identify with all of these things in consumerist culture, in a culture that would have us out of a sense of greed, out of a sense of competitiveness, pursue jobs and careers that that promise for this elusive status or stature of success, this place of this kind of vaunted position in society and among your friends and family, that can also be, if not put in its place and not viewed with the proper perspective, destructive. And he talks about it, and what I didn't remember, and was like a reminder in rereading this, was that people just shut down, having for years worked 60-hour work weeks at jobs that weren't fulfilling. And some people spend, I don't know what the statistics are, but there's a certain percentage of people who actually shut down. Maybe they've reached a certain level of success, and then they're completely burnt out, and have to shunt themselves away from people in their lives and any kind of life, just to come to some kind of sense of normalcy within themselves. This is a phenomenon also in the highly competitive culture of Japan, where kids are brought up to study like crazy, try and get into the best schools. It's really this kind of pathologizing of a whole segment of young people who have to attain these incredibly high grades because they're told to study untold hours. And what he says is interesting. He says that there's a rebelliousness naturally of shutting down and refusing to take part when these kids have reached their limits. But it's also this kind of so they sabotage themselves. They do things to make themselves ineligible they act out basically. But what ends up happening is they've managed to extricate themselves from this race of competitiveness that is really unhealthy, without realizing it. So, like on the surface of it, it may seem like, a particular child student is unhealthy, suffered a breakdown, but really it's a kind of protective mechanism among a certain percentage of students, who decide to just drop out, and react and respond in some ways. So I found that very interesting, because a certain amount of ambition is extremely unhealthy. Now, at the same time, I was thinking a lot about Jordan Peterson and how a certain amount of disagreeableness, a certain amount of ambition, a certain amount of wanting to achieve success and material stability is a healthy thing. So hopefully, we're giving a bit of a nuanced presentation here. It's not all bad to want material things. Of course, it's not all bad to want to succeed and to achieve some level of self-actualization and individuation and growth through a particular career path. But there is certainly a level of unhealthiness that the U.S. in particular nurtures in people without their even realizing it. I mean, we are some of the most greedy, power-hungry, competitive bunch of bleeps that Western civilization has ever seen. And it's so concentrated right now. It's so unhealthy. It's become so much a part of the norm. I mean, you might forgive Trump, for instance, for wanting to MAGA. But the way he's going about it with his persecution of Chinese companies that are in direct competition with the U.S. is crazy. So, if you've read this ongoing saga with Huawei, if that's how it's pronounced.
Huawei, I think.
Huawei, thank you. I'll brush up on my Chinese. It's awful. He has to literally persecute employees of this company that's providing competition for U.S. Technology companies, in order to bolster U.S. technology companies. It's pathetic, really, but it's also in a way pure Trump at its worst. So just a few thoughts about that.
Well, I want to go back to something you said right before that about the kind of, and something I said previously about the individualism and individualistic kind of nature, specifically that quote that I read from the book on what contributes to greed.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, and the idea that you said about trying to give a nuanced view. It's not like being individualistic, for instance, is totally bad, because there's often a debate between like the ills and evils of individualism versus collectivism, and some will be, put their stake in the ground for either one, and talking about the benefits of either one. And I think that in itself is an overly simplistic way of looking at things. It's like, the way I see it, there's positive individualism and negative individualism, and positive collectivism and negative collectivism. Because if you have nothing but like individualism, what that essentially means is that you think that you are you might agree that individuals have value, because that's the point of analysis, or the level of analysis that you look at the world through is through individuals. But like what people tend to think of when they think of individualism in a bad way is, you think that you're the only individual that has value.
Mm-hmm.
So you are only in it for yourself at the expense of other individuals. And then on the other hand, you have collectivists who see the group as the ultimate good. to the detriment of the individual. So like individuals, well, but then you have the healthy ones of both, or the positive poles of either one. So you have a positive individualism where you do see everyone as individuals, and you treat everyone as an individual as having value. So there's kind of a collectivism that comes out of individualism. By seeing everyone as a valuable individual, you naturally have concern for the collective, for the group in which you find these individuals. And then on the collectivist side, you have like the negative version and the positive one, which is the same thing, where you are looking out for the good, the greater good of the wider community. But so positive individualists will, I'd say, like, see themselves as individuals and be willing to sacrifice themselves for the greater good, for the group, essentially, for the community. They'll be willing to make a personal sacrifice because of that individualism, because of that individualism that they've developed in themselves. Whereas like a negative collectivist will sacrifice the individual for the sake of the group. So there's a difference there, right? So on the one hand, you have the group with no regard for the individual, sacrificing them for, the so-called greater good. It's like, well, sorry, you have to go because, we all need you to go. And then on the other hand, you have the individual saying, well, I'm going to sacrifice myself for all of you because I care about all of you. So there has to be some nuance in that view too. It's like, you can't just say individualism bad, collectivism good, or, collectivism good, or I can't even remember which order I was saying them in, but, you get the idea. There needs to be some middle ground, some nuance, taking those two options and looking at the positives and negatives of both of them.
Well, inherent in what you said goes back to what Jordan Peterson talks about a lot, which is personal responsibility. And so that positive individual is in sacrificing himself, taking responsibility for the greater good, or the community that he exists within, where the kind of negative person who is part of the group is going to shunt responsibility, scapegoat, and project all of the ills onto individuals who usually are ideologically at odds with what is then in vogue. And this kind of reminds me of a portion of the book where Schumaker talks about relationships with people, and how quite often, that the happiness that could be derived from giving of oneself and attention to friendship, to family, to children, to one's partner, gets sacrificed, and kind of deprioritized and belittled in the pursuit of kind of drawing things to oneself, as opposed to giving outward and sharing love and knowledge and attention outward. And he gives some excellent examples of how that exists in Western culture, in terms of the amount of time that most people spend at their careers, the amount of time people pursue doing things by themselves, on their phones, on their computers, self-absorbed on certain things instead of outwardly focused. And he gives some wonderful quotes along those lines as well. I'm going to look for them in a moment or so. If I can find them, I'll read them.
You look for those, and in the meantime, I'll read a couple quotes of my own. First, one from Einstein that Schumaker includes. Albert Einstein once said, "Happiness never appeared to me as an absolute aim. I am even inclined to compare such moral aims to the ambitions of a pig. Just some food for thought there. And then another one. This is from, not in the book, but this is from Gurdjieff's magnum opus, Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson, All and Everything. This is a quote he ascribes to the great Mullah Nasruddin, if you know anything of the donkey riding sage.
Mm.
And this is what Mullah Nasruddin had to say about happiness. Every real happiness for man can arise exclusively only from some unhappiness, also real, which he has already experienced. We kind of touched on one interpretation of that earlier when you said, everything that comes up must come down, that you can't stay forever in like happiness.
Mm-hmm.
You can try your best to stay forever in unhappiness, of course. A lot of people try to do that too, but it doesn't really work. That's not the way it's not human nature, right? Human nature fluctuates. But also there's another idea in there that has to do with sacrifice and what I was talking about earlier, is that you can only get happiness out of some real unhappiness. Because things go up and down, it's like you can look at that as being, okay, well, if things go up and down, that means that I can only be happy if I put myself through some unhappiness. It's part of the deal, basically. You can't be happy without some unhappiness. And I think Schumaker even points out that the only reason you can know what happiness is because you know its opposite, something to compare it with. You know what it's like not to be happy. So you can either put yourself at the whim of the forces of the universe to just blow you around like like a leaf in the wind, and I'm unhappy now because of these external forces. I'm happy now, and have no control over it. Or you can kind of like try to hack the system basically and say, okay, well, this is the way it works. So how can I make this work for me?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I know I'm gonna suffer. I know I'm gonna be unhappy. So how about I make my how about I choose my suffering? How about I choose my unhappiness to the degree that I can? And that, of course, involves sacrifice. So you have to choose what you're going to sacrifice. Choose where you're going to suffer to some degree, and that can be, it should be in the pursuit of a higher aim, of a further goal, a further target. It's like you're not just looking for suffering, right? Okay, what are the best ways I can just make myself suffer? Well, you could come up with all kinds of ways, but they're not going to be in the service of any greater goal. It's like that, and if you're doing that, you're just making your goal suffering. But if you're actually if you want to have some kind of if you want your suffering to have some kind of meaning in the context of a greater goal, it's like, well, that can be very easy. It's like, and people do that all the time. They just don't think about it. It's like whenever they have a goal, they will inherently sacrifice something. So when you're going to school, when you're trying to get a degree or whatever, when you're just in like elementary school and you're taking a test, when you have a test coming up, it's like you study, and that study is a form of suffering, most likely for for me it was. I didn't like school, but you set aside something that you want to do something that you don't want to do in order to get a goal that's out in the future that isn't immediately like relevant to you. It's like you're putting off your what do they call it in psychology, the with the marshmallow study, the delayed gratification.
Mm-hmm.
You put it off in the future and you make a sacrifice now for that delayed gratification. And you can apply that dynamic to every goal, every goal that you have. It's like, well, what is the suffering that you're going to have to go through in order to get that goal? Well, it could be that you sacrifice a lot of your time, and it could be that you expose yourself to a lot of criticism and even ridicule. But if it's in the service of the aim, then it has meaning, then it has purpose. It's like, and I think that's why, that's a big part of the story that most of us in the in Western and European cultures, and all over the world, the specifically Christian cultures, it's like that's the story of the Christ. It's that ultimate. It's that sacrifice. It's that sacrifice for a future gratification. Well, even then, like Schumaker talks about satisfaction and gratification, and how we don't really know what we're talking about when we talk about that, because like the satisfaction is something that comes basically when you fulfill like a need or something, or like it's the you have satisfaction when something is completed. So you have satisfaction when you like complete a level in a video game, or you finish reading a book, or it's that something has been satisfied, it has been like completed in some way. And but that's not happiness. In fact, what he says is that what stimulates happiness is that lack of satisfaction, because that lack of satisfaction, it's kind of like that's the drive to I guess to like reach out and find something new, or to do something. It's like any kind of action must come from a state of uneasiness, in the sense that you aren't satisfied right now, so you are looking for something, you're moving towards something, you're aiming at something. And it's that state that will basically bring happiness, because the satisfaction of some thing isn't the happiness. That might just be a small dopamine hit, like we were talking about. So he kind of warns that like in the face of, I think this is what he writes, in the face of widespread satisfaction, you need to work harder, you need to sacrifice in order to create that opening for happiness, that lack of satisfaction, that kind of readiness potential. It's like where I can't figure out how to describe it other than being in that state of unease. It's like wanting something more. And then he writes that complete satisfaction of false needs is basically what blocks happiness. So when you have all of these like minor like goals and aims that you're searching for, which could be like like shopping, like compulsive shopping. It's like when you satisfy those aims, it's like that won't lead to happiness. That blocks happiness, because there are these bigger aims and these bigger goals and these like wider aspects of life and of human nature that are being left neglected.
Mm-hmm.
And that should cause some unease, right? If you examine your life and you see that there are all these areas of life that you're ignoring, it's like that should be like, oh well, I've got to get my act together and see what I can do about in all these other areas of my life, and that will reorient your the targets that you're projecting into the future, which will then change your behaviors. And if when all of those are done in coordination with each other, you've got this kind of, that's the big target that I was talking about at the beginning of the show, that coordinates all of your other all your other aims, all the other things you're aiming at. And the process of moving in that direction and aiming at that larger target is like the kind of the push towards that goal of happiness, the ultimate happiness.
Well, that's the word right there, process, I think, which I kept thinking about as you were describing this, Harrison, that it is a process. It's not it's not something that we're always told that if you reach this level of attainment in whatever sphere, then you will be happy, then you could be happy. But that's not it. It's the perpetual searching for those things that do give our lives meaning in the deeper sense, that facilitate happiness without looking for happiness. And I guess there's a whole mechanism involved in living our lives and keeping on top of all the many different things that we need to keep on top of, that have less and less to do with the ephemeral goals and things we think will make us happy. But I wanted to read this portion here because I think it spoke to a number of things you were just mentioning on the subject of tomorrow, on the subject of this kind of long-term macro approach to attaining happiness indirectly. So Schumaker writes, the famous humanistic psychologist Carl Rogers wrote about the importance of becoming a person of tomorrow in order to arrive at a happiness that is superior to the type found in consumer society. Interestingly, He said that tomorrow's happiness would probably not be experienced at all like the happiness of today. The person of tomorrow may not even regard herself or himself as especially happy, since their approach to life would be growth oriented, one that regarded the good life as an ongoing process rather than an incessant state of satisfaction or titillation. The happiness of the person of tomorrow was seen by Rogers as the result of continually moving in the direction of caring, authenticity, wholeness, intimacy, and openness. It would also come by way of cultivating reverence for nature, learning the unimportance of material things, developing skepticism about technology and science as a harbinger of happiness, and expanding one's spiritual sensitivities. But this happiness was seen as possible only if individuals could shift authority to within themselves, while training themselves to become anti-institutional. This speaks of the fact that genuine happiness in today's world is a form of protest. Far more than a simple intellectual daily choice, it is a revolutionary response that calls upon the person to entertain doubt and to question the norms of their host culture. And I mean, I have to agree, especially about this last bit. We have to consciously make a decision not to become victims of host culture, groupthink, and conventional thinking on a number of things. There has to be a certain amount of time spent reflecting on the messages that we're being given, why they're being given to us, who they're being given by, and why we should or shouldn't accept those messages. At least so it seems to me. And in this age of information overload, it's a bit of work. I would say the default state should be to be skeptical, given the fact that the sheer numbers of messages we're being given are false, and likely to serve the people who are giving the messages or who are sponsoring the messages, or paying people to promulgate the messages. So finding happiness for tomorrow would seem to be a revolutionary response, as Schumaker says here. Because everything that we're being fed, it seems designed to keep us exactly where we've been, with very little of a pathway to a growth-oriented life and the ongoing process that would ultimately fulfill us a lot more than what we're being told.
Well, maybe before we finish for today, we've got a short video to play, but before that, I just want to say that I just want to reference Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration, especially for those viewers who haven't heard of it yet. We've covered it on our old show, Truth Perspective, but we don't have any of those up on YouTube yet. But Dabrowski would kind of he'd agree that kind of more with the Einstein quote that I read, that the kind of the drive for happiness as the soul, or the greatest goal or pursuit in life, is probably completely wrong-headed, and that well, he just like Gurdjieff argues for the role of suffering, and that basically, in order to kind of fulfill that human nature that Aristotle talked about, requires that those periods of unhappiness or disintegration that Gurdjieff talked about in that quote. And he kind of, I'll recommend going through our archives, checking out the Truth Perspective, or just finding Dabrowski's stuff online. And some of his books are available on Amazon, so check that out. And so before we end, here's a clip that we'll talk about a bit. This is from Roger Scruton and his appearance. I believe it was at Cambridge. I don't know. We'll include the link below just to be sure. But he appeared there with Jordan Peterson, and this was a question that they received. We'll only play Scruton's response, and it was basically just on this topic on happiness. So let's go ahead and play that.
What I would say is that happiness means ultimately your fulfillment as a person, and that isn't the same as gratification of your desires. It means the kind of transformation of your being, such that you can look on what you are and say, for all my faults, I accept that thing. And when an occasion comes to rejoice, you accept it and enter it, rather than asking yourself, "Do I deserve it?" That avoidance of joy, which many people have, is actually itself a kind of narcissism. The happy person goes out and embraces the occasion for rejoicing, and he does so because his own nature is at ease with itself, and he can incorporate this into it. Of course, there's a lot more to it. One has to have, as Aristotle says, happiness is an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue. What he meant was that if you don't have the virtues, you're treading always on thin ground, that you will fall through. That wonderful moment when at last she is going to say yes. You turn out, your nature as a predator is revealed, to use Jordan's image, and you fall irrecoverably. But anyway, that's a brief discourse on happiness.
Well, that was an interesting passage, and I liked what he said. I'm paraphrasing here. He said the capacity to accept one's faults, basically to see oneself, is perhaps connected with the capacity to accept one's successes and thereby experience joy from those successes. So I guess accepting the suffering of knowing that we aren't perfect, that I'm not perfect, that I indeed have flaws, that I make mistakes, that I'm sometimes in error, that I'm in the process of growing, is the same part of the same thing that will allow me to have a good feeling about something that I can more objectively say, that was good, that was accomplished, and thank goodness for that, and really have that moment of joy and accomplishment, and success put in its proper perspective.
Mm-hmm. And I think that I like the point he made about allowing yourself to experience joy, joyful moments, because a lot of people don't, and they think that they're not allowed to, or that it's bad if they do, or they just avoid it for whatever reason. But that too is just part of life. It's like, and if you're one of those people that doesn't like feeling good every once in a while, it's a real downer on everyone else too. So it's like, when you're interacting with, after this, Jordan Peterson talks about that's what he focuses on, and he talks about the importance of play and joking around, and I'm sure we all know someone who's just a total wet blanket, or the downer of the party, or who's always never willing to join in on the fun. And I think it's really important to play and to have fun and to laugh. And Schumaker talks about that in the book too. I don't know. I think I've kind of said everything I want to say about that. Any last thoughts, Ilan?
Well, maybe we'll revisit this in another context, another time. But yeah, I think we've covered it, and just want to thank our listeners for tuning in this week and listening. And we have a couple of good shows planned in the near future, so do tune in. And hopefully you'll be catching Objective Health and Newsreel as they come out on SOT. And until next time, take care. And thanks for listening. And find good ways to be happy.
All right, bye, everyone.